So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at camera specifications. So this is going to kind of tie into the idea behind like what you would look for if you were buying cameras, but also, what those specifications mean once you own a camera, what the drawbacks are of different specifications. So we're going to start off by taking a look at resolution. So when we talk about resolution, we are talking about probably terms that we've heard quite a lot, but maybe don't fully understand. So you've probably heard of the term 4K, and you've probably heard of the term, 1080 or 1080p. So most cameras, at a certain level these days are going to come as 4K or even more, to be honest. These days you do get 6K, 8K and upwards cameras. What does it mean? It's basically the resolution. So it's how big the picture actually is. The benefit being that you can punch in with 4K. So right now I am actually shooting on 4K. You can see this frame around me. If I suddenly wanted to just crop so that I had more of like a close shot, I could do that if I was filming in 4K because I kind of have the resolution. And theoretically, I'm not losing anything in comparison to that 1080p. The reality is that it takes up a lot of storage space, so that's something to consider. If you're constantly shooting in 4K, or if it's a really big project, then you're going to run into lots of data, which is going to cost you money in terms of hard drives. So constantly shooting like that, it will cost money. If I think about the outcome of a project, where's it going to end up? It's going to end up on Instagram, or it's going to end up embedded on a website and be a very small frame. If that's the case, then there's no real point in shooting in 4K. 1080p is going to be absolutely fine for most uses. So yeah, it's kind of assessing your project, thinking about data, thinking about whether you want that flexibility of being able to crop in. Those are kind of considerations when you think about resolution. So next up, we're going to take a look at sensors. And a sensor is essentially the small square or rectangle that we'll see at the back of a body when we take off a lens. So taking a look at this sensor in here, we can basically see that we have this shiny piece just at the back there. We don't need to go into too much depth around sensors, but essentially there's two different types of sensors that you'll probably come across when you're looking at camera specs. So these will be full frame and crop sensors. There's other different types of sensors out there, micro four thirds, 35mm. But yeah, the two kind of predominant ones are full frame and cropped. So what do these two mean? Basically, in terms of practical difference, a full frame is going to give you a lot better low light performance. So you'll get a lot less grain if you're shooting in low light conditions. It definitely has a big effect on quality. So full frame cameras, if you look at the kind of price range that they sit in, they are considerably better. They've got a better, you're using up the entire sensor rather than just a portion of the sensor, and for that reason, they just perform a lot better in terms of how the image looks. In terms of the kind of practicalities behind these two sensors, one thing that comes into play a lot for me is around the kind of lenses. So a full frame will take advantage of the focal length of a lens. So if a lens, so this lens, for example, is a 35mm lens. If I put this on a full frame camera, it is going to be a 35mm lens. If I put that on a cropped sensor camera, which is what this is, which is a A6300 Sony, then I'm not going to be getting a 35. That's going to exist more as a 50mm. So lenses, if you're buying them for crop sensor cameras, aren't necessarily what you think they might be. So you might just need to do your research. So broadly speaking, there are two different types of lenses. There are prime lenses and there are zoom lenses. So prime lenses are a fixed focal length. So that would be something like this, which is a 35mm. That is the only focal length that it has. And when I say focal length, I mean how big the frame is. So this camera sitting at the back right now, this is a 35mm, and this is the kind of frame that it's making. If we look at this B camera, this is a 50mm lens, and for that reason, it's a lot more punched in. It's a lot more of a tighter shot. Zoom lenses, on the other hand, would have a varying focal range. So they might be something like a 24 to 70, and they would have a ring that would be able to pull between those different things. So they're a lot more flexible. In terms of choosing which ones you want, Prime lenses, generally speaking, are a lot nicer in terms of the quality of their image. They often have a much lower aperture, which you might see written as a 1.8, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But essentially, yeah, that real kind of quality cinematic lens, you're often going to get that as a prime lens, so something that's fixed. The flexibility of a zoom lens is obviously very desirable. If you get a 24 to 70, that's that kind of classic range. You'll often hear 24 to 70. And it's going to do everything you want. If you want to shoot a wide angle, then it's perfect. And if you want to punch in and do something, a bit more refined with your hands, or if you're far away from your subject, those kind of things, it's just flexibility, really. So another consideration for cameras is inputs and outputs, quite basically. Different cameras are going to have different flexibility in terms of what you can plug into them and what you can plug out of them. And so, things like HDMI out, whether it's a HDMI out or a HDMI mini out, it might not even have a video output. Those kind of things, these kind of cameras, you'll often have little pull flaps, and then you'll see different inputs, outputs from there. Whether you can charge the camera, if you're shooting, I don't know, guest lectures or something, and the guest lectures run for, say, 2 hours, having a camera on power might be a really important thing. Things like 3.5mm jack, so that's like standard kind of like audio headphone jack outputs, something like that might be super useful. But yeah, generally we're going to have video outputs, power outputs, power inputs, audio inputs, and audio outputs. Those are the kind of typical things that we might see on a camera. It's up to you in terms of the kind of projects that you run, whether things might be more useful or less useful. It would depend on your other peripherals. What kind of audio equipment do you have? Is it really important that it goes directly into camera? So there might just be some considerations to think about in terms of what camera spec you're looking for. You might often find as well with certain cameras that you might have some kind of like top mount, and that would basically be something that would sit inside, would connect via a digital cable to the camera, and that would give you much more inputs and outputs. Certainly things like audio, that's really popular, like a little audio kind of mount that would go in the shoe here, and then that would give you lots more inputs and outputs. So yeah, looking at your camera, what camera you have, you might find that there's an external device that can improve what you can do with your camera. So just a few other kind of catch-all considerations in terms of camera specifications. So things like low light performance, different cameras are going to have different low light performance. The Sony kind of range is a really great example of cameras that have got really good low light performance. That's just something that, it's going to depend on how you want to shoot. It's always important, even if you're not doing, shoots in clubs and nighttime shooting, light is a really key part of making things look good. So yeah, that's something to kind of look out for. Whether a camera has autofocus can be, a lot of these things, they're kind of standard now if you're going above a certain kind of price range. But yeah, whether a camera does have autofocus or doesn't have autofocus could be quite important. If you're always going to be doing interviews, sit-down things, maybe that's not really important. But if you do want to kind of film some of that extra footage, follow things, what we call B-roll, like the extra footage that sits on top of edits, then maybe autofocus is something that you just need to make sure that cameras have. Frame rates is also quite an important thing. So, when we'll go into more detail, but frame rates is essentially the speed at which you can shoot, so that in post-production you can have slow-mo footage. So, 25 frames is the kind of classic. That's what we use here in the UK. But also shooting, so double that in 50 frames means that you can slow some footage down by half. On top of that, you have a 100 frame rate. So different frame rates are going to be able to produce different levels of slow motion, and then that will often couple in back to the resolution. So a camera might say, this can shoot in a maximum of 50 frames at 1080p, and that for you, that might be absolutely perfect, but you might want to be able to shoot in 4K at a higher frame rate. So you might want to shoot slow motion footage at 4K. Those kind of specifications are going to start to change on certain price points. This camera here, for example, does not shoot on 4K in higher frame rates. And then finally, stabilization. So, a lot of cameras will have in-body stabilization. Some may not, so the stabilization might come in the lens, or you might not have stabilization in either. So yeah, it's just worth looking out as to whether a camera has stabilization and also how good that stabilization is.